Hello, my name is Alexis Miller, and I'm with the Communications Branch of the Executive Council Office. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is a technical briefing on the heap leach facility failure that occurred at the Eagle Gold Mine on June 24th. Our aim is to give you an update of what's new since our last briefing. Today's briefing will focus on off-site environmental testing. Should you have questions outside of the scope of this topic, please contact Holly Dalrymple with the Department of Energy, Mines and Resources, or Jordan Owens with Cabinet Communications. As we've said before, we appreciate many of you have questions and concerns about the situation. We don't have all of the answers at this point, but we are here to share what we do know. Today, I'm happy to share that the Government of Yukon will be publishing an online content hub on yukon.ca by end of day to ensure Yukoners can access information regarding the Eagle Gold Mine leach field. This information will be available at yukon.ca-victoria/gold-update. It is also being translated, and the French hyperlink will be yukon.ca/victoria-gold-mise-a-jour. We will be posting updated information as it becomes available. Additionally, we will be publishing a recording of this briefing on our Government of Yukon Facebook page. I would now like to introduce our speakers, who will offer some introductory comments before opening the floor to questions. In the Department of Environment, we have Brendan Mulligan, a senior groundwater scientist, as well as Cameron St. Clair, a senior fisheries biologist. We also have Dr. Sidit Ranade, Yukon's Chief Medical Officer of Health. We'll now begin with Brendan Mulligan, senior water scientist. He will be giving us an update on off-site water quality monitoring and results.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for being here. My name is Brendan Mulligan, and I'm a senior scientist with the Department of Environment's Water Resources Branch. I'm here today to share an update on water monitoring downstream of the Eagle Gold Mine. Before I get into my update, I want to be clear I'm not able to speak about any of the activities taking place on the mine site. I'll only be able to answer questions pertaining to off-site water monitoring and water sampled in the receiving environment. Our monitoring efforts are based on the water monitoring and reporting plan that has been developed by Water Resources Branch in collaboration with the First Nation of Natchinayak-Dun, representatives of the Government of Canada, other Yukon government departments, and consultants in response to the heap leach failure at the Eagle Gold mine site. We continue to work with the First Nation of Natchinayak-Dun as a partner on water sampling and monitoring. Daily sampling is underway at most of the surface water sampling locations, with more results coming in every day. Before I get into the most recent results, I want to explain a bit about what we are testing for. The samples are being screened for various forms of cyanide, heavy metals, and other contaminants. The forms of cyanide that we are testing for are strong acid dissociable cyanide, weak acid dissociable or WAD cyanide, and free cyanide. And we're also testing the samples for thiocyanate and cyanate. The type of cyanide that we're focusing on in our results reporting is weak acid dissociable or WAD cyanide. We are focused on WAD cyanide because it includes both free cyanide and moderately and weakly complexed metal cyanides, and because there are acute or short-term and chronic or long-term guidelines for WAD cyanide for the protection of aquatic life. There are also water quality objectives for Haggard Creek for WAD cyanide, and they are the same as the chronic or long-term guideline for aquatic life. So our water sample results are being compared to aquatic life water quality guidelines and water quality objectives developed for Haggard Creek. Today, I have laboratory results to share from samples collected up to July 24th. Over the past few weeks, we've been observing a pattern of increasing cyanide concentrations in the water collected at sampling locations. This pattern has continued through our most recent lab results, and we are now seeing concentrations of weak acid dissociable or WAD cyanide in Lower Dublin Gulch. That's DG1 on the map. If you see the inset map there, there's 3 circled monitoring stations. We're now seeing concentrations of WAD cyanide in Lower Dublin Gulch, that's DG1 on the map, that significantly exceed aquatic life guidelines. The highest concentration of WAD cyanide in our test results are coming from the sampling stations closest to the mine site, as you can see on the map. Samples collected from 2 stations on Haggard Creek downstream of Dublin Gulch Those stations are W4 mix and W29. On July 24th, show levels of WAD cyanide that are modestly above aquatic life guidelines and the water quality objectives developed for Haggard Creek. WAD cyanide results from samples collected at station W99 or further downstream did not exceed aquatic life guidelines in these samples. We are seeing lower concentrations further downstream in Haggard Creek due to dilution of cyanide in the water. As the contaminants flow through Dublin Gulch into Haggard Creek, into the South McQuesson River and beyond, the cyanide is being diluted. I would like to note that although the samples from the sites I mentioned, DG1, W4 mix, and W29, are showing levels of WAD cyanide that are above aquatic life guidelines, the concentrations of cyanide that we're observing are still below the drinking water guidelines. This situation is evolving and it remains possible that the water quality conditions could change. We are continuing to use the most up-to-date information available to us to evaluate the situation and make necessary adjustments to our sampling program. This work, as I mentioned, is being done in collaboration with the First Nation of Nacho-Nayak-Dun, representatives of the Government of Canada, other Yukon government departments, and third-party experts. To date, our focus has been on monitoring water chemistry, but we're now adding two important components to our monitoring program: monitoring of water flows and monitoring of benthic invertebrates. I want to finish my update today with a quick note on groundwater sampling. Groundwater sampling is part of our monitoring plan, but it has not been implemented in recent weeks due to safety concerns. We are in regular contact with officials at the site, and we will resume groundwater monitoring as soon as it is safe to do so. While there are limitations in being able to collect groundwater data at this time, we are confident that our surface water monitoring program in Haggard Creek will detect any contamination leaving the mine site. Our surface water sampling coverage is strong, and our implementation of the water monitoring and reporting plan gives us a complete picture of the situation in the receiving environment downstream of the mine site. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Cameron Sinclair. I'm the Senior Fisheries Biologist for the Department of Environment. Today, I want to speak about the ongoing fish monitoring efforts in light of the water quality results that Brendan was talking about. And similar to Brendan, I'm just focusing on the off-site impacts. So in light of these things, I want to talk about what we're monitoring, why we're monitoring, and our progress to date for the fisheries program. First, what we're monitoring is both the short and long-term effects towards the fish population throughout the entire Haggard Creek watershed. This monitoring work's being conducted and collaborated with the First Nation of Nacho-Nayak-Dun and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and really focuses on changes in fish abundance, changes in growth rates, movements, patterns of Arctic grayling, changes in fish habitat, and determining the level of heavy metal accumulation in fish tissue over time. This work is being conducted across the Haggard Creek watershed at over 50 locations. 21 of those locations were actually sampled prior to the mine site in 2010, so we'll allow a direct comparison over time. And then secondly, why are we monitoring this in fish is really what are their effects of exposure to cyanide, both acute being short-term and chronic being long-term. Acute effects for cyanide when they're above the guideline that Brendan talked about, our biggest concern is lethal effects, or essentially fish dying quickly once it's above there. The chronic effects are fish that are able to tolerate above the guidelines, but that's more into effects such as increased respiration rates, changes in their reproduction rate, how much energy they're putting towards eggs to reproduce. Those eggs, when they're in the water, hatch success. And you'll see those potential long-term impacts towards the entire population over a long period of time. It also affects their swimming ability, their ability to adjust their own water content. And then those effects to heavy metal or bioaccumulation in their tissue over time. So these are the impacts that we're trying to monitor in the area to really provide a clear picture of what, if, and when anything is happening to the fisheries populations. And thirdly, our progress to date. We've been able to assess about 47 sites in the area. The map shows there the green sites are the ones that we've completed. The red sites are the ones that are inaccessible, and those black ones are the ones we have not finished. The reason for that is there's been some heavy rain in the area recently, and it's making the water essentially too turbid for us to effectively catch fish. So we've had to pull out until it clears up, hopefully in the next week or two. We've collected over 65 Arctic grayling and over 50 slimy sculpin that are being sent to our animal health unit, and then further on to an external lab to get that heavy metal testing. The testing that we'll see this year, we're not predicting much change, but it gives us a really good baseline of what's happening now that we can look back and compare against. As of now, we have not observed any dead fish outside of the mine site. As I noted last week, the Energy Mines and Resources Inspectors Report highlighted that several Arctic grayling within the site right after it happened were found dead. We still haven't found those results or received those results. They're with Environment and Climate Change Canada. This work that we're doing is really being the next sort of phase of this is being discussed in close collaboration with the First Nation of Natchitoches, and it really involves what we can do to potentially mitigate any sort of further effects on fish. We don't have the specifics yet because we're still in discussion and designing it, but it will potentially involve fish fences and creating barriers in certain aspects of that entire watershed to protect fish. Probably limited time, but we'll discuss that further. And if anything changes, we'll be back here updating everybody. And then the last one is, like a lot of programs, these programs are very adaptive and can change over time. The numbers can change over time. We'll update it as needed. And then I also wanted to talk, the Department of Environment is working with our partners to develop an ungulate monitoring program. Hunting season just started today, to gather information on the long-term effects of wildlife in the area. More details on that specific program will probably be coming out in the next week or two. And again, we'll provide updates if anything changes, if we find new information over time. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Oh, okay, maybe I'll feel like this mic is really sensitive. Can you hear me without? Okay. So my update this week is not materially different from last week. So it's in essence, you know, as you've heard, it's a very dynamic situation. We continue to monitor it with our partners, but I will just reiterate the things I said last week, just for clarity. So the regulated drinking water system in the area is not thought to be at risk. Confirmatory testing has enabled us to have more certainty around that, but we're sure that the regulated drinking water system in the area is well protected and not affected by this incident. With respect to recreational water use, so swimming, boating, things like that, right? There are no restrictions or recommendations to change activity downstream from that area, although there are recommendations in the immediate area related to, you know, not using parts of that creek and not fishing in the area, and that is mostly related to the instability and the situation being dynamic on the site, as opposed to any concerns related to the numbers that we're seeing of sampling coming from that area. And then finally, with regards to hunting season starting at the beginning of August, there's no recommendation for changes to any behavior related to hunting in that area or to the consumption of game or wild meat. And so you will hear further, as we've just heard, if there's a monitoring program and what the details of that will be. But at the moment, there's no concern or restrictions around hunting and fishing activities outside of the areas that are posted.
Reporter, one question and one follow-up. I'll ask, please identify who your question is directed to. We'll begin with reporters in the room.
We'll then turn to reporters joining remotely. Please say in the chat if you have questions you'd like to ask. We'll start with Sarah, Radio-Canada.
Hi, thank you. I do have some questions regarding the water. Do we have a timeline on when we will be able to access groundwater? And I just want to make sure I understand correctly. We did have access to it and now we don't have access to it. Is that correct?
That's correct. There was an initial round of groundwater sampling that took place following the incident. But when the restricted and exclusion zones were defined for the area, the wells that were sampled fell into those zones. So we haven't been able to safely access those. I don't have information as to when we'll be able to access those, but we're in connection with the people. And when they give us approval to do that, we'll resume groundwater sampling.
Okay. And another question for you, actually. You did mention that there was some heavy rain over the last week. Do we know if it has had an impact on water quality or if it could like increase the risk of the cyanide going everywhere?
The most recent laboratory results that I have and am able to share today are from July 24th. So there's a lag in the time that it takes for us to collect the sample, send it to the lab to analyze the sample, send us the result, and us to be able to share that. So I don't have results to share from lab results for the past week to see that effect, what that effect will be. But in forming our interpretations, that's something we'll consider absolutely.
Thank you. We'll now go to Julian, CBC.
Yeah, hi. So I've got a couple of questions. I think these would be best answered by Brendan Mulligan. You mentioned that cyanide levels have exceeded guidelines for fish. And I'm just wondering to what degree they have. There are a few sites, I believe there's Lower Dublin Gulch, I believe, and others. And I'm also wondering if you can provide like an exact concentration of those levels to sort of provide some context for folks so we understand what you mean by those things.
Sure. So yeah, I can cite some numbers for you now, and these will be shared on the website when that is launched. So the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment has a long-term guideline for WAD cyanide, which is 0.005 milligrams per liter. And the province of British Columbia has a long-term guideline for WAD cyanide, which is the same, and also an acute guideline, which is 0.01 milligrams per liter. On July 24th, we observed WAD cyanide at DG1, which is the mouth of Dublin Gulch, at 0.0596 milligrams per liter. At W4 Mix, which is the first water quality monitoring station on Haggard Creek, downstream of the confluence with Dublin Gulch, at 0.00558 milligrams per liter. And at W29, which is the next station on Haggard Creek, downstream of W4 Mix, at 0.00573 milligrams per liter.
So given those concentrations there, you mentioned real cyanide, WAD cyanide. These are technical terms. I think for the people listening, it would be really important to hear what levels like these how they could affect fish. And if you could sort of explain some of these terms that are not, for everyday Yukoner, we don't understand what these things are. So
and maybe I can show up with that. So anything above, if we say the CCME guideline of 0.005, anything above that is the guidelines there to aim that there will be some sort of effect to fish once it reaches that. There's a lot of variation in flow and temperature. Even species may vary, but we just stick to the guideline that anything above that is going to have an effect on fish. And like what I was saying at the earlier stage, the low amounts is you're going to see those chronic issues where you may have a change in swimming pattern, or essentially they're impacted because they're breathing it. They're in the water, and this is why it's much lower than like the human guideline. They're going to be breathing in whatever's in the water, say in this instance cyanide, and it's going to affect their respiration rate and where they're putting their energy. So they're not going to be reproducing as much, like I said earlier. Those are the chronic ones that you can't tell sort of immediately if you're doing an assessment. Now, where it becomes the sort of the switch between chronic and acute, we're going to have a dead fish. Is hard to say an exact number because it all depends. Is it a juvenile fish? Is a fish that doesn't have a good condition? So there's potentially a weak fish that may be impacted more broadly or more acutely. So that's why we sort of stick to that 0.005, that once it reaches that, it will have an effect. Whether it's acute or that chronic one really depends on the fish and where it is, how healthy it is, and everything. But we really want to say, like, once it's reached that guideline, then it is affecting fish in some way. If that answers your question.
Awesome. We have Tim, the Yukon Star.
All right. I guess my question is probably for Mr. Mulligan. Last week it was announced that the government was starting construction on that safety berm, and it also included groundwater monitoring wells. How is that progressing?
Yeah, I can't speak to activities that are taking place on site, so I'm here to speak to water quality monitoring in the receiving environment downstream of the site.
So who would I talk to about that? Because I've been told that the work on the berm and the wells has now been backtracked.
Next, we'll go to Jim, Yukon News.
Thank you very much. I guess just firstly, have you been informed as to whether the mine is discharging treated water yet?
Yeah, I don't have that information and can't speak to what's taking place on site.
Okay, I got a follow-up about that. I guess just when we do get treated water being discharged into Dublin Gulch and then into Haggard Creek, I guess firstly, do you expect that that will result in lower concentrations of cyanide? And also, does that impact your sort of ability to assess the impact of the groundwater if there's also treated surface water being discharged into the system?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's a dynamic situation in a dynamic environment. And I'd say our monitoring plan is designed to enable us to continue to track impacts on the receiving environment. So as new information becomes available every day, we continue to refine our interpretation. So we'll continue to do that going forward. And we're also committed to revising our monitoring plan as events warrant. And that's something, as I mentioned, we do in collaboration with the First Nation of Natchinaik-Dun, representatives of the Government of Canada, other departments within Yukon government, and some external technical experts.
Thank you. Next, we have Stuart, Shone FM.
So excuse me, this question is probably for Brendan Mulligan. We got some clarification on aquatic life guidelines. Could I get a little clarification on drinking water guidelines for concentrations of cyanide?
On you want the specific number? Yeah, so the federal guideline, I don't have it at my fingertips here, but I want to say it's 0.2 milligrams per liter.
Can I just add to that? The federal guideline is for free cyanide. So it's important to remember that as we're talking about these different types of cyanide, the federal guidance for drinking water is actually related to free cyanide, which my understanding is that is a subcomponent of these other cyanides that are being measured, WAD, SAD, et cetera.
That's correct.
So for clarity then, if for instance, we've got the 0.01 milligrams per liter for the acute, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be 0.01 milligrams per liter of free cyanide.
Correct.
Awesome. We'll now be going online for reporters online. And first we have Daryl from the Canadian Press.
Hello there, thank you. I'm wondering if you can perhaps speak to maybe a hypothesis you had about these results versus what you found. Was there a large discrepancy between perhaps what you expected to find and what you did find?
Yeah, so our interpretations are based on the evidence that we have available to us. So that's what I'm speaking to.
So these results that you got are in line with perhaps what you expected, or perhaps with similar incidents in the past. I'm just wondering if these results, like when you use language like significantly exceed guidelines and things like that, and especially for these off-site testing things, it speaks to perhaps what could be expected after an event like this versus the reality of the situation now.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's such a dynamic situation in an already dynamic receiving environment that's very difficult to form expectations of what's going to happen. So we're trying to stick to interpreting the data we have from the field and from the lab and form our interpretations around that.
For one more, when you're talking about the results from 2010, is that what you're going to use as a baseline to compare these current results to?
I'm sorry, I'm not clear which result from 2010 we're
It was
speaking
your
to.
colleague who mentioned the past results.
Yeah, the 2010 results were part of the environmental assessment for the area, and those results were around fish abundance, and they also took some heavy metal contamination or heavy metal tissue samples for, I believe it was arsenic, mercury, cadmium, and iron. So we're going to be comparing the results that we're taking this year to 2010 as sort of our, has there been any change since 2010?
And those results are expected when?
So the results that we're sending out with our animal health unit, which I talked about, the tissue samples, they take some time. Once they get sent out to the lab and they're back in Whitehorse now, probably a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks before we get those results back. But the key thing there, those results will show what the levels are now, and these are accumulating heavy metals or bioaccumulating heavy metals. So we're not expecting that those results will show any impact from the slide. But as we go forward next year and the year after, we'll be able to look to see if there has been change.
Thank you. We'll now move to Kanina, CBC Yukon.
Hi, good morning. I was wondering if you could tell us, just based on what you are seeing with the test results, how concerned are you about the results so far?
Sorry, who's that addressed to?
Whoever would like to answer it.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I can speak to a level of concern. What we do is compare our sampling results to established guidelines and share those findings. So that's what I'm here to do today, is to, and that's what I have done today, is establish that we've observed exceedances of relative guidelines for the protection of aquatic life at the mouth of Dublin Gulch and in those 2 stations immediately downstream on Haggard Creek.
As a follow
Nina, I think you're muted. Oh,
yeah, with regard, just as a follow-up,
yep.
can you give us any more updates on what you've found in terms of heavy metals?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mentioned before that there's a lag in receiving results from the laboratory. And in that lag, so samples are collected, sent to the laboratory, they're analyzed there, and we get the results back in different batches. So the results I'm reporting on today, which go to July 24th, are for the various forms of cyanide. We don't yet have the metals data for those results. So I don't have an update on metals data from what was provided last week, unfortunately. When we have that information, it will be shared on the website. And if there's anything that warrants discussion at a future briefing, then we'll address it then.
Thank you for that. And just a quick question for clarification with regard to the groundwater sampling and the inability to get to some of those sites. Can you just explain, is that because of the forest fires in the area, or does it also have to do with instability at the mine site?
It has entirely to do with instability at the mine site. So geotechnical engineers have established restricted and exclusion zones, and the wells that we've identified as relevant for sampling in response to this event in our monitoring plan unfortunately fall within those zones, and so we can't safely access them at this time.
Okay, thank you. And those exclusion zones are established by the company?
I can't speak to that.
You can email Holly Dalrymple at yukon.ca and she can answer that question for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a bit more time. Does anyone have a follow-up question for today's panel?
Just one question about those 2010 baseline results for the fish monitoring. Do you know offhand what stage of production the mine was in 2010 when those were taken, or how much excavation had gone on site?
Yeah, I don't know the exact, if there's a number of excavation or what was happening there. That was part of the YESAB review. I'd say like any mine, there's probably some excavation before they put in their EA. But as far as production, I don't think that was, I think it's before that, but I'd have to confirm that to be sure.
Are you starting to see any salmon in the area?
Yeah, good question, Jillian. So the salmon run, I don't think I need to go into sort of the dire strait of how bad the salmon run in the Yukon is. But and that's working with the DFO or the Fisheries and Oceans Canada. The closest sonar, I believe, is the Stewart one. And they're starting to come up. I don't know the exact number offhand, but the salmon run is commencing and going up there. Salmon are certainly a concern in the area, with some juveniles found just sort of outside of that area. Salmon are really geared on their natal stream where they were coming from. So if they spawn there, they're like a direct line to try to get back. The numbers are for salmon are extremely low in the Yukon in all drainages, and we're having discussions with the First Nation Nuu of can we mitigate that? Is there spawning compared to today's spawning activity and what's known or not known there, along with traditionally is there a concern over salmon spawning? So there's not probably a whole bunch to talk about salmon other than the fact that they are on their way through the area. They're just really known to be in the South McQuestion. And it appears that the Haggard Creek is more of a juvenile rearing area, but there's not a whole bunch of information known about like exact locations. So we are working with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and I believe there are discussions on potentially doing some aerial flights to see if there's red counts and to get that number sort of more refined in the South McQuestion to understand what the risk, or if there's any potential risk of a loss of salmon in that area.
Yeah, just one point of clarification. Do you know then or not know where the spawning grounds are of these salmon? Like, do you have that information accessible? I know there are various sites. Do you know for a fact that there's salmon habitat spawning areas in the sites nearby, or?
That's what we've been asking Fisheries and Oceans Canada, since they're sort of the lead on salmon, is to get that information if anything is known about exact locations. And we've been raising that question with them, and their teams are working on it to get us that answer, because that's going to help when we look at any potential mitigation, and do we mitigate or do we not? For instance, like a fish fence, do we put it in? Salmon will like I said before, they're really geared on those natal streams where they're coming from. So if you attempt to essentially block it, they're still going to be knocking on the door essentially until that gate's open. So that's kind of out of the question on some, but we're having those discussions because we really need to know the number, if there is increased cyanide, and where those sites would be for sure.
Any more questions? Okay, that concludes today's briefing. Thank you to our speakers and to everyone who tuned in. Have a lovely Thursday.